Welcome in, everyone. We'll be starting in a couple minutes. Thank you for coming in. Just give us a couple more minutes for people to join, and we'll get the program started very shortly. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I just ask that everyone keep themselves muted for the duration of the program. You are encouraged to share any questions in the chat tab, and I will ask our speakers your questions during the Q&A portion, which begins at 12:30. The tab should be available at the bottom of your window. Time is limited. Time is limited, but we hope to get to as many questions as possible and are grateful for your understanding if your question is not able to be answered. I must also note that this program is being recorded and live streamed, so if you do not want to be on that recording, please turn off your video camera as well. And finally, if you enjoy this program, we have several other fantastic programs coming up over the next few months, including Visionary Woman 2022, our brand new Exploring Identity series, and for your kids, Walking the Walk for middle schoolers. You can find these programs and more if you head over to the link in the chat. And with that out of the way, my name is Andrew Feigenbaum, and I serve as the Communications Director at Interfaith Philadelphia. For the past 18 years, Interfaith Philadelphia has challenged the region's residents to dare to understand one another. One way in which we spread interfaith understanding is through our Dialogue Face-to-Face series. For those of you for whom it's their first time attending, this is a new program of ours that we piloted in summer 2022 and are excited to continue with today's program, co-organized by my wonderful colleague, Lindsay. This series hopes to lift up voices of local leaders who will share their interfaith perspectives on a variety of interesting topics. Over the next 45 minutes, you will hear from two such leaders as they speak on faith in action on gun violence. Let me briefly introduce you to today's speakers. David Brown is an ordained reverend in the United Methodist Church and serves as the diversity advisor to the Office of the Dean at Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. Drick Boyd is Professor Emeritus of Urban and Interdisciplinary Studies from Eastern University. He is a founding member of Heeding God's Call to End Gun Violence and the author of Disrupting Whiteness, Talking to White People About Racism. Take it away, David and Drick.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Andrew and Lindsay and the folks for Interfaith. We had ourselves on mute just to make sure that we can model what we're asking folks to do. So we'll, again, encourage folks to stay on mute if possible, just so we can have the right audio as we move forward. We know we're going to run out of time, so we're going to get right to it. My friend and colleague, Drick Boyd, and I have had these conversations with each other, so it's a privilege to be able to have these conversations on somewhat of a platform. So Drick, why don't you go ahead first with your introduction?
Yeah, hello everybody, and thanks, David. Thanks for being here. I'm honored to be here with my friend David Brown. As he said, we've had these conversations, and so probably what's going to happen is we're just going to talk, and you're going to be overhearing what we're having to say, and you'll get a chance to get your words in as well. While I have been involved in the work of gun violence prevention for probably about 15 years, I want to acknowledge all those people in our city and perhaps even on this call who have either been victims of gun violence or are friends and family members of people who've been victims of gun violence or lost loved ones to gun violence. And I want to also acknowledge groups like Mothers in Charge and Every Murder is Real, people who have been on the front lines of this issue for decades. Those of you who have really had to do with this directly in your lives are the ones probably have the most to say on these issues. And I hope you'll feel free to share when we get to that part of our time. For me, how we approach this issue comes down to something I learned from Stephen Covey, the author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He said, how we see the problem is part of the problem. And I think it really applies to this issue, because if we see this issue as simply a matter of too many guns, we will try to put limits on the number and kinds of guns that people buy and own, but we may not get to the heart of the issue. And if we see the issue as just a matter of some bad apples, some irredeemable criminal sorts of people who simply need to be arrested and locked up, we'll use the language of getting tough on crime, but I don't think we'll really get to the heart of the issue. I mean, these approaches can have some effect, but they don't get to the heart, which I believe is the lack of access to essential resources like education and healthcare, issues like racism and hopelessness and trauma that impact people's lives, and a culture that too often in life and in the media and in the entertainment world seems to say that your worth and dignity is tied up on how well you can use a gun, and that's how you resolve issues. We resolve issues in violence. And I think we in the faith community can and should have something to say and do about that. And I hope we can get into that today. So I look forward to the conversation. I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Drick. And I couldn't agree more. I think that the Stephen Covey quote is a great way for us to start our dialogue in terms of how we see the problem is also part of the problem. My perspective is a little bit different in that as an African-American male who grew up in Philly, this is my hometown, my home country, as I call it. I've been the victim of gun violence. One of the most definitive moments of my life was having been luckily a survivor of a botched drive-by shooting when I was a teenager. And I was determined that chased me right off the streets. And I don't know about anybody else on the call, but the first time that you have a gun pulled on you, you think it's the last time you're going to have a gun pulled on you. And I grew up in West Philadelphia, great neighborhood, 2-parent household, very traditional, went to Central High School, and yet still. So part of it is how do we look at the problem? And I think that one thing that's going to certainly inform our discussion today is the role that the faith community, and not looking at, and Drick and I have had this conversation, as our communities as being separate, bifurcated, as opposed to being more permeable and more partnership. I think that that's part of this is a complex problem. And Drick, you hit the nail on the head. It is not just those folks over there who may not have access to, and you fill in the blank from there. Certainly that is part of it, but also the role that we can all take in terms of addressing some of these issues. So I think it might be worthwhile. And I just to provide a little bit of frame of reference that in addition to serving as ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church, I also have responsibility here at Temple University as a diversity advisor. So certainly where we are in terms of the work that we do, geographically located, this is something that I see some of my Temple colleagues on the call, as long as some of my other clergy colleagues, that we deal with on a regular basis. So one of the first questions that we've been asked to tackle is what is the faith community's role in addressing gun violence? And I think that if it's okay with you, Drick, I'd like to take a cut at that and then pass it over to you as we have our dialogue together. And that is that I think that certainly the faith community has an important role to play in addressing gun violence. But I would also say, and you can see in the chat that our folks at Interfaith have encouraged us to use the chat if you have questions that we can pose and can prompt our answers as well. And that is, as it relates to the faith community, I unfortunately see too often the faith community is at the tail end of the problem, in that I have had the unfortunate task of funeralizing some young victims who have been affected by gun violence, or at least counseling and talking with students, or not just students, but people who are been victim of violence, which means that we're a little late to the party. It's too late. At that point. And I would say that a lot of faith communities, and I'll speak specifically within my African-American brothers and sisters, unfortunately, have not been part of the solution as much as we would like to. I think that a lot of our churches are finding that those students or those people, those folks who are either committing the crimes or victims of crimes, have not been part of the congregations. And unfortunately, we're too quick to marginalize those folks as if those are the problems. And if we are really true to our calling, those are our solutions. Those are the folks who are part of our flock. Need not be a member of a church in order to to be pastored to, if you will. And I think that we've got to work more in partnership and really go where the fish are. You know, COVID has forced us out of our buildings, and appropriately so. We needed to be more on the streets than we had been in the past. And I think that the role that the faith community needs to play is to be able to be more in partnership with other organizations that, quite frankly, have greater credibility with some of the folks who are being either victimized or victimizers of gun violence in our city. Drick, I'll pass it over to you for your view on that question.
Yeah, I want to just sort of say a couple of things and respond to the last thing you said. You know, I think the faith community, and I'm speaking in Christian language, so I apologize for that, but for those of you who are not Christian, but I think the faith community generally has two roles in this. One is the pastoral and the other is the prophetic. And the pastoral, you know, is what you were referring to in funeralizing people, ministering to people who are family members of people who've been killed or people who are victims themselves. I know a lot of times churches and synagogues and clergy leaders are called out to do, you know, prayers at vigils and that sort of thing when someone has died at a particular location. And I wouldn't want to say that isn't important, because I think it is important. I think there's a very important role to play. But to your point of that, it's after the fact. And I think actually a lot of the responses we hear in the culture in generally are after the fact. Even police, you know, the police don't show up until something has happened. And what we really got to get to, and what I think we're seeing with some of our city leaders, is recognizing that waiting till something happens is not a solution to the problem. It's after the fact. And so how do we address some of the underlying conditions that may contribute to people turning to violence? And to your point about coalitions, you know, there was about a month ago, or maybe it's 2 months ago now, there was an announcement in the local paper, in the Inquirer, about a group of organizations were coming together in West and Southwest Philly to address gun violence. And one of the things that really struck me about that, I knew a number of the people whose faces were in the picture, and most of them were people of faith. But the organizations represented didn't include faith communities. And I do think we have something to offer. Not only in terms of just the people who are part of our congregations and our groups, but also there's something about, at least in the Christian tradition, we talk about the ministry of presence, that being available, being there. And so often we are sort of cloistered in our own groups and don't see that by sometimes our mere presence, we can have an impact on young people and other people who are affected by this issue. So thinking about what is it that we as the faith community have to offer to these coalitions, and that might be of help in addressing these problems before they arise. I think it's really, really important.
I couldn't agree more, Drick. And I would also say that on the other side of that is that unfortunately, a lot of our churches and communities of faith have hurt some of the folks who need our help. And sometimes when we show up, either collared up or robed up and so forth, it kind of reinforces some of the trauma that those quote unquote bad kids have run away from us earlier in there, and we've not been active in trying to seek them back. I would also say, kind of to your point of recognizing that from the perspective, because we are interfaith, that I think that we also need to and break down more silos, that this is not a Christian response or Islamic response or a Catholic response. This should be a human response, a divine response, that we can find more things in common, that we can work together. And I think that part of what we need to kind of look at doing, and I completely agree with what you were saying, is that we need to find ways to build some bridges that can help us come as a collective. But also, I would say, we need to not to be as performative. I can't tell you, and I know you've been there too with your work, showing up as a part of the vigil, as opposed to being part of the planning that prevents the vigil, or that can be more proactive to have less vigils and more more vigilance in terms of being able to connect folks in a manner that's going to be meaningful, which kind of gets us to that second question about that we've been asked to tackle, and that is, what do we see as the factors that contribute to the rising gun violence in Philadelphia the past 2 or so years? And I would say, if I can take a first cut at that, it's been a confluence of things, but I would think that it's been actually things that have been brewing under the surface for a long time that have been exacerbated by the conditions in which we find ourselves. I mean, over the last 2 years, certainly we've endured not only the physical challenges of the pandemic, but the mental challenges of the pandemic, being isolated, losing jobs, losing what would be normal, and so forth, has only exacerbated, put a lot of people in some confined spaces where it can be very combustible, and that results in the violence. And kind of to the point you made before about having access to employment and education, in particular, knowing that a lot of the jobs that have been that were plentiful before the pandemic have evaporated, and particularly in some of the communities in Philadelphia where we find a really focus on or a concentration of violence, and that's not a good thing. I think also too that we, and particularly in communities where we've experienced some of this violence, we haven't done a lot of work around mental wellness, because I think that also has been a stigma in some of the communities that have been affected by violence. And I think that part of those things together, and since we're talking about faith, I had mentioned before that I think if there's anything that's good to come out of the pandemic, is the fact that a lot of churches have been forced out of the confines of their walls and doing things by Zoom and technologically, but also, we needed to be more in the outside our walls well before this. And so if there's anything we can take away from this, I think that, again, back to the point of how these things have risen. These things have risen because we need, because of those factors that I mentioned, but we need to learn lessons from those things to make sure that we can learn things, not to go back to where we were, but to bounce forward, bounce to a different time, to a much better level of involvement, cooperation, and things of that nature that will make sure that we learn from the lessons of the last 2 years.
Yeah, if I can just kind of build on some things you said, someone who has kind of helped me go a little deeper in this issue, and I think is quite relevant to what we're talking about, is a sociologist out of San Francisco State University who's done a lot of work with youth in Oakland and in San Francisco, particularly youth of color. His name is Sean Ginwright, and he talks about the sources of violence being a mixture of hopelessness and trauma and a feeling of powerlessness. In other words, the world is happening to me. And early in my career, I was a youth worker in Boston. Now, we didn't have, guns were not as widely available in the 1970s as they are now when I was doing that work. So I may have heard guns, but I never actually saw a gun. But I did see that so many young people didn't expect to make their 18th birthday, or if they did make it, they expected to be in jail. And I contrast that with my own upbringing when I thought 18 is when I get to start life. It's like I'm free of mom and dad, and I can go. And I had in that time, I had lots of conversations with young people about that there is life after 18, and it doesn't have to end up with just those two options. And what Ginwright says is that we need to really, whatever we do needs to really address that hopelessness. And he uses the language of love and compassion and in building people's dignity. And when I read him, I don't know if he's a person of faith or not, but that sounds like faith language to me. And I have a friend who's he's a ward leader and a leader in his community in Southwest, who is a very dedicated person of faith. Now, I don't know if he's been, how he sees what he does in relationship to his involvement in his church, but that man is a minister to the community and has connections with young people and other folks where he can really talk with them out of his faith in a way that really speaks to that hopelessness and sense of powerlessness that they they experience. And I think there's a lot of people in our churches and our mosques and our synagogues and other houses of faith who have those kind of skills if they were really sort of commissioned by their faith communities to be those ministers. So often when we talk about the church or the synagogue or the mosque, or we think of clergy, and certainly clergy have a role to play. But I think there are many ways in which those of us who are not clergy can have a role too, just being good neighbors and just being good people to reach out to folks who are struggling in these communities. Because I think so often we see that as someone else's job, whether it's the police or the mental health professionals, and certainly they all have a role to play. But there's something about being just with people and present to people and speaking to them. And I know a lot of grandmothers and mothers who are, they have a ministry on the whole block to just the young people. And they look at Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so as someone they can go to. And those are the kind of people we need to lift up and really strengthen, I think, in these times, because they're the ones who are in a position in many ways to say the things that need to be said and hear the things that need to be heard. And most of those people, from my experience, are people of faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, and I know we got and I would encourage folks, there's some great stuff happening in the chat, people sharing information, which is great. But I agree with you, Drick. I think that the bottom line is, who do you trust? Who do you trust to be able to go to? And I will tell you very honestly, when I was chased off the street after that drive-by went the way that God intended it to go, I can tell you the first person I talked to was not my pastor or my youth pastor. It was really someone who I asked me the right question. And the right question is, what the hell are you doing on the street corner at that time? And that really, but also even in that question, affirmed to me that there was more to life, to your point, that my life had ended at 13, I wasn't one of those persons that thought that I would never make it to 18. I just needed to get the affirmation that, that was a mistake. Let's turn those things around and you can move forward, which I think that, kind of leads us to our next question that we've been asked to tackle, and kind of looking at, opportunities. And I think dialogue is a critical opportunity for things. And one of the questions was, how has clergy activism played out in the Ahmaud Arbery and Kyle Rittenhouse trial? And I think that that's a great question to kind of focus on, because those types of things, and I happen to teach at Temple around advertising and public relations, so using the news cycle to open these dialogues are critical. So I would say a couple of things on that. First, clergy activism, to your point, need not be just clergy who are activists. It needs to be able to empower our institutional voices as well as our individual voices. I think that it's going to be very important for us to be able to do that. But by the same token, I think that folks who identify as clergy need to start to get more comfortable leaning into these very difficult conversations. And I would say even that, whether it's the Ahmaud Arbery case or the Kyle Rittenhouse case, that it really needs to focus on what is our ability to have the type of language that can engage folks in these types of dialogue. And at the same time, we need to be able to develop our better listening skills, because these conversations are happening all the time. Whether or not we're a part of it is kind of like our choice. But I think that we have an obligation, and I would say that specifically, even in my work at Temple, I teach students about how to have conversations like that. So that means I need to be equipped as a professor to have these conversations. But let's take all the enshrinements away, because I'm just a person on the corner who's going to have a conversation with somebody and being able to engage them in that. Because I think a lot of times our activism can sometimes, as clergy, be performative as opposed to being substantive. I think that if we don't have these kind of authentic conversations, even with ourselves, as to what level of comfort or competence, quite honestly, do we have to dive into these types of conversations, not necessarily to persuade other people, but to understand their perspective so we can be understood. That to me is critically important. And I think sometimes, and I hate to say this, but whether it's Ahmaud Arbery or Kyle Rittenhouse, there's going to be another opportunity any minute for us to have these conversations, because these challenges are always going to be there. And I think we miss a huge opportunity by not leaning in. And if we don't lean in, then I think that we're kind of being lazy a little bit, letting ourselves off the hook, but also we're missing an opportunity to engage in some productive conversation that can lead to more effective activism.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I wanted to mention two things that I'm aware of where I think it's a really constructive effort by members of the faith communities to address this issue in the way we're talking about. The first is the organization Power, which is an interfaith organization. And one of the many issues they are working on is gun violence prevention. And they've connected it to mass incarceration and police violence and all of those things that are intertwined in this, because the violence is not only amongst neighbors, but it's also sometimes police against residents of a community. So that is an organization I think that is really trying in good faith to address this issue at a proactive way. The other is something I've been involved with, which is called the Restorative City Initiative, and it's being headed up by Reverend Donna Jones, who's a pastor in West Philly. She's also the executive director of the Metropolitan Christian Council of Philadelphia. And over the last couple of years, she's been training people in restorative justice practices. And the ultimate goal, which I think people will begin to see being rolled out this year, is really to have people in all the neighborhoods throughout the city who have been trained in these practices and have the capacity to be the neighbor who can walk over and help mediate a conflict that may have gotten out of hand, or even a domestic kind of situation that may have gotten out of hand. And the idea with the Restorative City Initiative is to take these skills and make them available to just everybody, youth, older people, grandmas who are the ones that people listen to, and equip us as individuals and as communities to resolve differences and deal with conflicts in ways that don't lead to violence and don't lead to death. So I think there are some exciting things happening right now that I find very encouraging. And as I said, I'm part of the Restorative City Initiative, which I think has some great possibilities.
Absolutely, Drick. And I'm seeing that there's some great questions. I know I'm watching our time to make sure that we can end enough time so we can have more dialogue on this, but it does lead us to at least the final question we've been asked to address, and then we're going to be able to kick it back to to you as the folks who are participating in this, and thank you all for connecting in. And that is, what are the faith communities and Interfaith Alliances doing and can be doing in Philly, both proactively and reactively, to racial and or gun violence? I would say that racial violence and gun violence are actually separate, and they are connected. I get that. So let me try to take a cut at this and then hand it back to Drick, and then we'll be able to answer some of the questions, and a great question has been posed in the chat, and those that would like to do so. So I think that in addition, and I'm glad you mentioned the Metropolitan Christian Council of Philadelphia. I'm privileged to have served on that board and work very closely with that group. The Interfaith who's hosting this, I think this particular time in particular that we're find ourselves on Zoom right now is also part of that, and part of having these very meaningful dialogues that we hope will also engage in some action. I would also point to another organization I do a lot of work with, NewCore, the New Conversational Race and Ethnicity, which is how to listen and tease out conversation. And sometimes, folks, I think that we think that talk is cheap, but I would say talk is the precursor to action, because I think that a lot of times we've got to understand the complexity of some of these issues to be able to move some things forward. And Drake also mentioned Power, which is moving a lot of things forward, very much interfaith in its approach, and it is not willing to, to not only march, but to figure out how we can affect things like policy and legislation and activism that can help to do this. Because I think a lot of times in Philadelphia, and that's probably true of most major cities, we tend to kind of play the blame game. So is it the mayor's responsibility? Is it the police commissioner's responsibility? Is it the parents? And it's all of those, as well as us. I think that, we all have to be able to, have a seat at the table to both plan and to activate. It's very, very important. And I think in the chat, you're seeing that folks are starting to share their own resources. And that was exactly the intent of this type of dialogue, because no one organization can do it. And I'm sure some folks are familiar with an old African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that we need to find ways to go together more often, because we all have different parts of the responsibility, which means we also have different parts of the solution that we need to put in place to be able to move some things forward. So let me pass it back over to you, Drake.
Well, I'm seeing we're at 12:30, so I'm going to open it up. Andrew, I guess you're taking the questions, so why don't you fire away and we'll try and address them.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation so far. And these questions coming in, please feel free to keep them coming in. And we can also have the opportunity to connect people offline as well. So the first question comes in from Dale Cleary, and he says, it takes a good deal of courage to openly participate in faith efforts to confront gun violence. Are we asking more than people can handle when we look to the people in the faith community to get involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's there are many ways that we can be challenged by this. Early on in my involvement, I was part of a group of people who tried to get a gun shop to stop or slow down his participating in the straw purchasing process, by which illegal guns get on the street, and most of the guns that are used in street crimes are illegally purchased, and ended up getting arrested and spent some time in the county and the city jail for that. But beyond that, yeah, I mean, it does take a lot of courage, and I think we have to think of it in terms of the community of faith, not just one individual of faith, because there's something powerful in us doing things together and being present together. And there are many ways I think that faith communities already serve the community, whether it's food pantries or clothing drives or medical clinics. I mean, I would just add this to those kinds of things, that it's not just one individual or two individuals, but it's really a commitment and a part of the faith community. Say, this is something we want to do. And I think that's where being part of a coalition that may involve not only other faith communities, but other entities as well, to kind of find out where is our niche, because I think we do have a niche, but we don't have to do it alone.
Right. And if I could say, I think that Dale, to your point about courage, and I agree with Drick that it does take a great deal of courage, but I would say two things that are important to that. One thing that helps us is the notion of collaboration, because we know we can't all do it together. I do it alone, that we need to do it together. But I would also say there's a certain therapeutic value in working together, because I think that, when you are dealing with the trauma of gun violence, whether it's fatal or has a wounding, it is something that you have to process through. So being able to have people that you trust that can help us think through some of these things and continue to endure the work, I think that is very important. But I would also say that the third thing that relates to that is how we are connecting. So collaboration is key. Therapy is key, but I think connecting is important, because once we connect as a faith community, the point that Drick made, as opposed to what we're looking at as individuals, we can get a better idea of seeing that if I don't have enough bricks for my straw over here, there may be some straw over there that can help make these bricks happen. And I think that unfortunately, we tend to be siloed in terms of our denominations, siloed in terms of our faith traditions, siloed even in terms of just faith in general, when we know we need to be able to branch out. And in that branching out, we'll be able to have, I think there is collective, when we get to be a collective, courage can be increased, because when you do it alone, it is a scary, seemingly insurmountable task. But when you do it together, it does feel like it can be doable, it can be achievable, and invite more people into that tent. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, David and Drick. Next question comes from Vanessa Hassan, who says that sadly, we've seen recently that parents are involved with the violence being perpetrated by their children. What messages are faith leaders saying to their congregants and neighbors about how actions in their home are creating violent dispositions in their children and desensitizing folks towards violence through things like violent video games, TV shows, and movies?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, you want to go, Drick, and I'll follow you?
Well, I don't know what they are saying. What I wish they would say, I think is more, I think the question kind of answers itself in that sense, is that, we are, and I kind of referenced at the beginning, we are living in a culture of violence. I was kidding with someone the other day. I look forward to the day, instead of TV shows on the FBI and the NYPD and the Chicago PD, have a show called Restorative Justice Philadelphia.
We need a better title, but yeah, I feel you.
Yeah, RJ Philadelphia. It's because we have created, I mean, the games and everything, and people say, oh, they don't really affect how kids act, but it's how we think, I think, is very important in terms of how we act. So I think the question is right on target, and it has to be something we address openly, even if we don't think that our youth or our families are involved. If we don't know, right. We often don't know, and so often when someone is involved in this, whether it's a school shooting or it's something on the street, people say, well, he was a good kid. We didn't know he was going through that, and of course, we don't know, and we can't stop it. So.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Rick. And I would say, I'm going to steal Dale's comment about courage. I think that we who have the privilege of a pulpit or a privilege of a speaking opportunity need to have the courage to kind of call it as we see it. I think that a lot of times our messages are kind of sanitized, and sometimes outside the, there's so many stories within, at least in the Christian tradition of the Bible or other texts that are important to other faith traditions that enable us to speak to some of these things. But I would also say, and not to borrow a tired cliche, we find ourselves preaching to the choir. The folks who are hearing our messages, one, are in denial that the quote unquote folks who they're calling as good kids are in fact good kids, but we're also not equipping them to how to do some things differently, like reducing screen time, things of that nature. I mean, there's so many different games that are out there, different experiences that are reinforcing or almost normalizing violence that we need to be able to speak to, not at the time when we're funeralizing someone whose life is gone too soon, but in our regular messages that enable us to both inform and equip the congregations that are gathered to hear our messages. And even as we're looking at ourselves on Zoom, we don't know who's connecting in, and that's an important point, I think, in terms of being able to have messages that both resonate and equip people to do things that are differently. So certainly being able to provide an alternative. And I hear what you're saying. I was giving you a little grief about, another sitcom, not a sitcom, but a dramedy, RJ Philadelphia, Restorative Justice Philadelphia. But I really do think that we have to find different ways to provide content that will engage and inform. And that gets beyond what we're doing on a Sunday message. We have to recognize that we are competing, we as folks who are people of faith are competing against a range of different things that already has the attention of the folks we're trying to reach. And I think that we need to be much more creative about how we're going to be able to speak some of those truths, and may not necessarily shame folks, but can certainly provide a way in to say, I need help, and here's how help can be provided.
I just want to jump in there. I've seen in the chat, a couple of people have mentioned Heeding God's Call, which is another interfaith organization that's trying to deal with things on the legislative level. And I think one of the things that made me think of is that while we're talking about the problems here in Philadelphia, the problems we are facing here in Philadelphia have ramifications and are influenced by things that are happening outside of Philadelphia by legislation that is passed or not passed. I mean, Philadelphia has tried to pass laws in which they could restrict the sale of guns to maybe one a month or something. And because of the state law that doesn't allow municipalities to pass those kind of laws, we haven't been able to do that. So there are many ways, even a legislative way. I think, the tragedy is that it seems to have gotten worse over time rather than better in terms of the legal side of this, but I did want to at least honor that because people have been putting that in there.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Next question is from Susan Cohn, which is, how do we make young men feel safe enough to not have to arm themselves or use violence? How do we show them that manhood is more and that they have choices?
Mm-hmm. Mm. If you don't mind, Rick, I'd like to take that because that's a reality that I live with. I have been around so many young men who feel that they have to be armed in order to walk these streets. I happen to be one of those persons that have been around guns all my life, as I had mentioned before at the top of my comments, that have been victimized by guns and so forth. But I have never, and it's been, I'm resisting it because I'm not carrying a gun myself. I think that it's a combination of things that have to happen in terms of how, when you feel safe, that is a very subjective term, a very subjective state. and also kind of recognizing that you're working against a reality where if everybody's carrying but you, it becomes, say, well, I think I have to carry it if only to protect myself. I think that, and I hate to say it, but it's just my reality, is that just having one conversation at a time with folks. And I think that the point that was made earlier about showing a different way, showing that there are other opportunities that, like I said, the fact that that drive-by didn't go as the person who was perpetrating intended saved my life. And showed me that there are other things that I could do and should do. That was my last night on the streets, just hanging out. And as I said, that was kind of like my journey, and it's informed my path. And I try to share that story with as many as people as I can. But from a structural standpoint, being able to have realistic economic opportunities, access to education, things that will show you that life is not defined by, and I think, Drick, you mentioned this, defined by, what kind of jewelry I'm wearing, what kind of car I'm driving, where I'm living, those material things that are ephemeral, quite honestly. And I think that sometimes we don't always have the opportunity to provide those types of resources. So that gets, to the bigger issue around legislation, around funding, around different investments, and that can start to show over time, and it is going to happen over time. It's not going to happen overnight, that we can make our young men who are most victims and victimizers to know that there's a better way.
Yeah, and you made me think. I was a young man I heard about who was offered a job, but it was about 5 blocks away from where he lived, and he didn't feel safe going any more than 3 blocks from his home. He would kind of lived he felt safe within a 3-block square area, and that's a reality. I think that those of us who have not had those kind of experiences that you described don't appreciate it. That it's so many young people are caught in this cycle of violence and fear, and it's very real. It's very real. So I appreciate your sharing that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question, maybe 2, if it's quick. David Rovner asked for you to comment on the following. At the breakdown of the nuclear family in the absence of a sense of caring local community because of poverty and substance abuse, decreasing practice of religion, and easy access to guns are the principal causes of urban gun violence, particularly among young people.
That's a great point. And I would say that, you're absolutely right that when you say the breakdown of the nuclear family, I think that the reality is that, we have families in which we're born into and then families which we choose. I think that part of what we have to look at is how we can start to expand the definition of what family is to be able to have a more positive influence. And I agree with you that there are a lot of things that are mitigating factors like substance abuse and poor economic conditions that we talked about before that really kind of exacerbate an already dire problem. And certainly during the pandemic and the racial reckoning, that has become an even more prominent issue. I think that we, as I mentioned before, need to figure out how we can learn from what we've experienced over the last 2 years and to be able to apply some of those things. And I think from my perspective, and also seeing some that's been shared in the chat, there are some very promising things that are out there that are starting to take hold and take some traction that will kind of direct us toward a better way, because we know that, we're never going to be able to go back to what we have been, which actually I think could be a good thing, and how we can learn from the crisis that we're in order to grow forward.
Yeah, and I would just say that what was described there has often been used as, and has been tagged to blame. It's sort of like it's your fault. And I think I hear those words as a call to action. Okay, those are realities. Now, what are we going to do? And I appreciate that. And it's not an excuse to point a finger. It's a call to action.
I'm going to drop one more question because I thought it was an interesting one to end on. Talking about from David Anderson, who mentioned how, gun violence is such a complex issue, and there's so many different approaches that people are taking to address it. How might we cooperate or work together on those different kind of approaches? Do leaders of the anti-gun violence groups talk to one another and see where they can unify their approach? And if they aren't doing that, do you have any ideas or suggestions for how they can develop a unified approach?
Bill, you go ahead, Drick, and I'll follow you.
I think the answer to the question are people in these various movements, are they talking to each other? I think they are. I think the complexity of it sometimes makes the conversation difficult, because I may be working on education access and someone else is working on dealing with trauma, and all things are connected. And so could we do it better? Absolutely. And maybe David, you can speak specifically to the faith community's role in this, and is there efforts to kind of talk together amongst people who are involved in various leaders of faith communities?
Absolutely. And I would say that part of it is that we haven't, and I'm talking the collective we, not just the faith community, haven't necessarily worked together. A lot of things have driven us apart from each other. One of them is funding. If we're all competing against each other for funding, then that, I'm going to hold my cards and you not show you mine. I think we've got to find ways, and funding could help to do that, that would encourage collaboration as opposed to not. I would think also that, particularly in the faith community, I think we have to stop making excuses and showing up late in the continuum. And if we're not invited to the party, forcing our way into the party. I think that, to Drick's point before, need not necessarily be the clergy, if you will, could be the laity who is faith focused in terms of having that role in those conversations. Because I think that we're finding ourselves at a crisis point, and that's not not a shocking statement to anybody, but in times of crisis, any idea is a good idea. So, good ideas don't care where they come from. So I think that we have to stop focusing so much on ownership of the idea and start to focus on how we're going to implement the ideas together.
Well, thank you both so much. I want to invite you to say any final words, any groups that you want to name again and draw attention to for people to learn more. And we will be sharing out this recording afterwards. So if David and Drick have any other resources or links that they want to send to me, I'll include that in the recap email. But last words, and then I'll say a quick closing.
Go ahead, Drick.
Well, I'll speak as a layperson. If you're a layperson in a faith community, you need to go to the head of your organization, whether it's a clergy or a clerk or whatever or a mashti or imam or whatever their title is, and say, if we aren't talking about this, we need to be talking about it. Because I do think it's a critical issue, and it's not divorced from spirituality and faith. It's very central. I mean, if we're talking about the dignity of human beings, if we're talking about peace, we're talking reconciliation. Yes, those are theological concepts, but they are very real life concepts as well in this issue.
I think my last word is that, I love the fact that this is sponsored by Interfaith, because it really is going to require that connection in everything that we do, and also stop relying on what we've done traditionally, because we recognize that this is a time in which we've never encountered before. Pandemic, racial reckoning, you name it, this is all new. So we need to find ways to be more interconnected as opposed to separate. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to have solutions that will be sustained over time. So I really appreciate having had this opportunity to have this dialogue with you all.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for being here.
Thank you both, David, Drick. Really appreciate this. We could have had this been a 4.5 hour dialogue, and we wouldn't have said everything that needs to be said. So thank you for your work, for taking the time to share with all our participants. Thank you, participants, for joining. As I mentioned, we have lots of other programs. We'll have more dialogues coming up this spring, TBD. But if you have any questions or interest in connecting with David and Drick, please reach out, and I'll try to make some connections here as well. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day. And yes, take care.
Thank you.
Take care.